Hello, dear listeners. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey back through time to a world very different from our own. A world of cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses, where church bells mark the hours and the scent of fresh bread mingles with less pleasant odors in narrow medieval alleys. It's the year 1518, and we find ourselves in the city of Strasbourg, nestled in the heart of what we now call France, though back then it belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. The summer sun beats down mercilessly on red-tiled roofs, and the Rhine River flows lazily nearby, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of merchants and travelers from distant lands. But this is not just any summer in Strasbourg. This is the summer when something extraordinary happened. Something so strange, so inexplicable, that people would speak of it in hushed whispers for centuries to come. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, when an entire city lost itself to an unstoppable rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me paint for you a picture of a time when the line between reality and madness blurred like morning mist over the Rhine. Chapter 1. The City Awakens. Picture, if you will, Strasbourg in the early morning hours of July 14th, 1518. The city is slowly stirring to life, like a great slumbering beast stretching its limbs after a long night's rest. From the towering spire of the cathedral, the first bells of the day ring out across the red-tiled rooftops, calling the faithful to morning prayers. In the narrow streets below, shutters creak open one by one. Bakers have been awake for hours already, their ovens glowing like small suns in the pre-dawn darkness, filling the air with the warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread. The tanners are beginning their day's work by the river, where the smell is, well, let's just say it's considerably less pleasant than the bakeries. Strasbourg in 1518 is a city caught between worlds. It's prosperous, thanks to its position on the Rhine and its thriving trade routes. Merchants from Italy bring silk and spices, while German traders arrive with furs and amber. The city's famous printing presses, some of the first in all of Europe, work day and night producing books that will spread knowledge and ideas across the continent. But prosperity has not reached everyone equally. In the winding side streets and cramped quarters near the city walls, another story unfolds. Here, families crowd into single rooms, sometimes 8 or 10 people sharing a space barely large enough for two. The smell of unwashed bodies mingles with cooking food in chamber pots, creating an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. The summer of 1518 has been particularly harsh. Crop failures have driven up the price of grain, and many families go to bed hungry more nights than not. Disease spreads easily in the crowded conditions, and the mortality rate among children is heartbreakingly high. It's a time when life hangs by the thinnest of threads, when a single bad harvest or outbreak of plague can reduce a thriving family to beggars in a matter of weeks. The city's governance reflects this divide. The wealthy merchant families control the city council, making decisions that often benefit trade over the welfare of common citizens. The Catholic Church maintains enormous influence, with elaborate ceremonies and festivals that serve both to inspire faith and to distract from earthly troubles. On this particular morning, as the sun climbs higher and the streets fill with the familiar sounds of commerce and daily life, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. No one could have imagined that by evening, their ordered world would be turned completely upside down by the actions of a single woman whose name would echo through history. The woman's name was Frau Trophäa, though history has preserved little else about her personal life. Was she young or old? Rich or poor? Happy or desperately sad? We can only guess. But what we do know is that she was about to become the unwitting catalyst for one of the most bizarre episodes in human history. As the morning progresses, Frau Trophäa goes about her daily routine. Perhaps she visits the market, picking through vegetables and haggling over prices like thousands of other housewives across the city. Perhaps she tends to children, or helps with family business, or participates in the endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, and mending that fills the days of medieval women. But something is different about this day. Something indefinable hangs in the air, like the electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm. The city seems to hold its breath, waiting for something, though no one knows what. Chapter 2. The First Steps. It begins so simply, so innocuously, that at first no one pays much attention. Picture the scene. A narrow cobblestone street in Strasbourg, probably somewhere near the city center where the streets widen just enough for people to gather. The afternoon sun slants between the overhanging upper stories of half-timbered houses, creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the worn stones below. Frau Trophäa emerges from her house, but instead of going about her usual business, she does something unexpected. She begins to dance. Now, dancing itself is not unusual in medieval times. People dance at weddings, at harvest festivals, during religious celebrations. Dancing is one of the few free pleasures available to people whose lives are otherwise filled with backbreaking labor and constant worry about survival. But this is different. Frau Trophäa's dancing has no music to accompany it. There are no musicians playing jolly tunes on pipes and drums. There's no celebration, no festival, no apparent reason for her to be dancing at all. And yet, she dances. At first, perhaps passers-by smile and shake their heads. "Look at Frau Trophäa," they might say to each other, dancing in the street like a young maiden at her wedding feast. Some might assume she's had a bit too much wine, or perhaps she's celebrating some private good fortune. But as the minutes turn to hours, the smiles fade from people's faces. Frau Trophäa shows no signs of stopping. Her movements become more frantic, more desperate. Sweat pours down her face, but still she dances. Her breathing becomes labored, but her feet continue their relentless rhythm against the cobblestones. Word spreads through the neighborhood like ripples in a pond. People begin to gather, forming a loose circle around the dancing woman. At first they watch with curiosity, then with growing concern. This is not the joyful, celebratory dancing they're familiar with. This is something else entirely. "Frau Trophäa," someone calls out, "what are you doing? Why don't you stop and rest?" But if she hears them, she gives no sign. Her eyes seem focused on something beyond the physical world, something that only she can see. Her movements become increasingly wild and uncontrolled, yet somehow still maintain a rhythm, as if she's dancing to music that only she can hear. The medieval mind is quick to assign supernatural explanations to unusual events. In a world where most people cannot read, where scientific understanding is limited, where the church teaches that the world is full of demons and spirits seeking to corrupt human souls, it doesn't take long for whispers to begin circulating through the crowd. "She's been cursed," one person murmurs. "It's witchcraft," says another. "Perhaps she's been possessed by an evil spirit," suggests a third. As the afternoon wears on, Frau Trophäa's condition becomes increasingly alarming. Her face, initially flushed with exertion, begins to take on a grayish pallor. Her breathing becomes ragged and difficult. Yet still, impossibly, she continues to dance. The local physician is summoned, a learned man who has studied the classical texts and understands the balance of the four humors that medieval medicine believes controls human health. He examines the dancing woman as best he can while she continues her frantic movements. But he's clearly baffled. This doesn't fit any of the known categories of illness or madness that he's been trained to treat. Her humors are clearly out of balance, he pronounces, though with less certainty than usual. Perhaps an excess of sanguine temperament, or possibly a corruption of the melancholic humor. We must bleed her to restore the proper balance. But how do you bleed someone who won't stop moving long enough for you to safely apply leeches or make an incision? The physician retreats, promising to consult his texts and return with a more comprehensive treatment plan. As evening approaches, torches are lit in the street. The crowd has grown larger, and people are beginning to look genuinely frightened. Frau Trophäa has been dancing for hours now without rest, without food, without water. By all rights, she should have collapsed from exhaustion long ago, yet she shows no signs of slowing down. Some of the onlookers try to physically restrain her, to force her to stop and rest. But she fights them off with surprising strength, as if the very act of stopping would cause her unbearable pain. Her family members plead with her, beg her to explain what's happening, but she seems unable or unwilling to respond coherently. As the first day turns to night, lanterns are hung from the surrounding buildings to provide light. The crowd begins to thin as people return to their homes for the evening meal and rest. But many remain, fascinated and horrified by the spectacle unfolding before them. And through it all, through the gathering darkness and the concerned murmurs of the crowd, through the attempts at medical intervention and the pleas of her loved ones, Frau Trophäa continues to dance. Her movements have taken on an almost mechanical quality, as if she's become a marionette controlled by an invisible puppeteer. The first day of the dancing plague of 1518 has begun. Chapter 3. The contagion spreads. Morning comes, but it brings no relief. Frau Trophäa has danced through the entire night, her movements never ceasing, her feet never stopping their relentless rhythm against the cobblestones. The crowd that gathers as the sun rises is both larger and more anxious than the one that dispersed the night before. Word has spread throughout Strasbourg like wildfire. In a city of perhaps 30,000 people, news travels quickly, especially news as strange and disturbing as this. People come from all corners of the city to witness the impossible sight of a woman who has been dancing for nearly 24 hours straight. But what happens next is even more impossible to believe. As the morning progresses, something extraordinary begins to occur. One by one, other people in the crowd begin to dance as well. It starts with a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, who had been watching Frau Trophäa with intense fascination. Suddenly, without warning, she steps forward into the circle and begins to move in the same frantic, rhythmic manner. Her eyes take on the same distant, unfocused look. Her breathing becomes labored in the same way. "What are you doing?" her companions cry out in alarm. "Stop this nonsense and come back." But she doesn't respond, any more than Frau Trophäa had responded to similar pleas. Within minutes, she too is fully caught up in the same inexplicable compulsion to dance. The crowd reacts with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some people push backward, as if whatever affliction has taken hold of these women might be contagious. Others press closer, trying to understand what they're witnessing. Within an hour, a third person joins the dancers, then a fourth, then a fifth. By midday, there are a dozen people dancing in the street, all of them moving with the same frantic energy. All of them apparently unable to stop. The crowd has swelled to hundreds of onlookers, and the atmosphere has shifted from concern to genuine panic. The city authorities are summoned. The mayor arrives with several council members, their faces grave as they survey the scene. In a medieval city, maintaining public order is crucial to prosperity and survival. Anything that disrupts the normal flow of commerce and daily life is seen as a serious threat to the community's well-being. This is clearly the work of the devil, declares one council member, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone whose worldview provides ready explanations for supernatural events. We must call for the priests, suggests another. If this is a demonic possession, only the power of the church can drive out these evil spirits. But even as they debate, more people join the dancers. A middle-aged merchant abandons his stall to begin the same frantic movements. A young mother hands her baby to a friend and steps into the circle. An elderly man, despite his age and apparent frailty, begins to dance with an energy that seems impossible for someone of his years. The pattern becomes clear to the terrified observers. Anyone who watches the dancers for too long seems to become susceptible to whatever force is compelling their movements. It's as if the dancing itself is somehow contagious, spreading from person to person through visual contact alone. Panic begins to set in among the crowd. Mothers grab their children and hurry away from the scene. Merchants hastily close their shops and retreat indoors. The streets that had been filled with the normal bustle of daily commerce begin to empty as word spreads that something supernatural and dangerous is loose in the city. But not everyone flees. For every person who runs away in terror, another seems drawn to the spectacle with an almost magnetic attraction. They come to stare, to try to understand, and all too often, they end up joining the dancers themselves. By evening of the second day, there are nearly 30 people dancing in the street. They range in age from teenagers to elderly grandparents, from wealthy merchants to poor laborers, from men to women to children. The affliction seems to respect no boundaries of class, age, or gender. The dancers themselves show signs of severe physical distress. Many are drenched in sweat despite the evening air. Their faces are pale and drawn with exhaustion. Some appear to be muttering or singing under their breath, though no one can make out the words. Yet none of them stop dancing, not even for a moment. Food and water are brought to them, but they refuse all sustenance. When people try to force them to eat or drink, they become violent, lashing out with surprising strength. It's as if their entire being has become focused on a single, overwhelming compulsion. They must dance, and nothing else matters. The local physicians arrive in force, bringing with them all the medical knowledge of the early 16th century. They examine the dancers as best they can, checking for signs of fever, looking for evidence of poisoning, testing the balance of humors through various traditional methods. But their conclusions are contradictory and unsatisfying. Some declare it a case of mass hysteria, a psychological affliction that has spread through suggestion and imitation. Others insist it must be a physical illness, perhaps caused by contaminated grain or tainted water. Still others fall back on supernatural explanations, declaring it clear evidence of demonic possession or divine punishment for the city's sins. As night falls on the second day, Torches and lanterns are again arranged around the dancing ground. The sight they illuminate is both mesmerizing and terrifying. Dozens of people moving in perfect synchronization, their bodies swaying and leaping and spinning in patterns that seem to follow some invisible choreography. The sound is equally disturbing. The slapping of feet against cobblestones creates a rhythmic percussion that echoes off the surrounding buildings. Labored breathing and occasional cries or moans from the dancers add an eerie vocal accompaniment. And underneath it all, some observers swear they can hear music, though no musicians are present and no instruments are being played. The dancing plague of 1518 is no longer a curiosity or medical mystery. It has become a full-scale crisis that threatens the very fabric of Strasbourg society. Chapter 4. The City in Crisis. The third day dawns on a city transformed. What had begun as a single woman's inexplicable behavior has become a phenomenon that defies all understanding and threatens to engulf the entire population of Strasbourg. The number of dancers has continued to grow through the night. By morning, there are more than 50 people caught in the grip of the dancing compulsion. They fill the street where it all began, and their numbers have begun to spill into adjacent areas. The sound of their feet against the cobblestones has become a constant percussion that can be heard throughout the surrounding neighborhoods. The city's normal routines have been completely disrupted. Markets that should be bustling with morning trade stand nearly empty. Their vendors either too frightened to open for business or too fascinated by the dancing to focus on commerce. Schools and workshops close as teachers and masters find their students and apprentices drawn away by the spectacle. Even the churches report reduced attendance, as people either flee the city in terror or become so obsessed with watching the dancers that they forget their religious obligations. The economic impact is immediate and severe. Strasbourg's prosperity depends on trade and commerce, both of which require predictability and order. Merchants from other cities arriving to conduct business take one look at the chaos in the streets and quickly depart. Word is already spreading along the trade routes that Strasbourg has been struck by some kind of supernatural plague, and other cities are beginning to restrict travel and trade with the afflicted community. The city council meets in emergency session, but their discussions quickly devolve into arguments and recriminations. Some members blame the dancing on the moral corruption of the lower classes, insisting that this is divine punishment for sins like gambling, drinking, and sexual impropriety. Others argue that it's a medical crisis requiring scientific intervention rather than moral judgment. We must call in the most learned physicians from across the region, insists Councilman Heinrich, a prosperous cloth merchant whose own warehouse workers have begun to abandon their duties to watch the dancers. This is clearly some kind of disease, and diseases can be cured if we apply the proper knowledge and treatments. Nonsense, retorts Councilman Friedrich, whose deep religiosity is well known throughout the city. This is obviously the work of Satan himself, sent to test our faith and punish our wickedness. Only prayer and penance can save us now. The debate continues for hours, growing more heated as reports arrive of additional dancers joining the afflicted group. By midday, the council faces a terrible reality. The dancing plague is not only continuing, it's accelerating. At the current rate of spread, it's possible that hundreds or even thousands of citizens could eventually be affected. Meanwhile, in the streets, the situation becomes increasingly desperate. The dancers have now been moving continuously for more than 60 hours, and the physical toll is becoming horrifically apparent. Many are covered in their own blood, from feet torn raw by constant contact with the rough cobblestones. Their clothing is soaked through with sweat and in some cases torn from the violence of their movements. Yet still they dance. Several of the afflicted collapse from exhaustion, but even lying on the ground, they continue to move their arms and legs in the same rhythmic patterns. When concerned family members try to carry them home, they fight with surprising strength, as if being removed from the dancing ground would cause them unbearable agony. The city's physicians work frantically to understand what they're dealing with. They consult ancient texts, perform astrological calculations, and attempt various traditional treatments. Some try bloodletting, believing that the dancing is caused by an excess of hot blood that needs to be drained from the body. Others attempt to force the dancers to drink herbal concoctions designed to restore the balance of the four humors. Nothing works. Dr. Paracelsus, one of the most renowned physicians of the age, happens to be traveling through the region when news of the dancing plague reaches him. He arrives in Strasbourg with great fanfare, accompanied by a retinue of assistants and a wagon full of medical instruments and exotic remedies. This is clearly a case of choreomania, he announces confidently, using the medical term for involuntary dancing that has been recorded in classical texts. The afflicted are suffering from an imbalance of the vital spirits caused by... He pauses, examining several of the dancers more closely. Actually, this is unlike any case I've encountered before. Even the great Paracelsus, with all his learning and experience, finds himself baffled by what he observes. The dancers show none of the typical signs of the dancing manias described in ancient texts. They're not jovial or celebratory. They don't respond to music or rhythm from external sources. They seem to be dancing to something that exists only in their own minds, something that drives them with an intensity that defies medical explanation. Religious authorities fare no better in their attempts to address the crisis. The local priests organize prayer vigils and exorcism ceremonies, believing that the dancing is caused by demonic possession. They sprinkle holy water on the afflicted, wave crosses and religious relics in their faces, and chant Latin prayers with great fervor. The dancers show no reaction to these spiritual interventions. They neither flee in terror from the holy symbols nor show any sign of relief or recovery. They simply continue their relentless movement, as if the priests and their ceremonies are completely invisible to them. As word of the dancing plague spreads beyond Strasbourg, it attracts attention from across Europe. Scholars, physicians, and theologians begin to arrive from distant cities, all hoping to witness this unprecedented phenomenon and perhaps contribute to understanding it. The city finds itself hosting an impromptu conference of some of the era's greatest minds, all struggling to comprehend something that challenges their most fundamental assumptions about human nature and behavior. Yet for all their learning and expertise, none of these distinguished visitors can offer a satisfactory explanation for what they observe, much less an effective treatment. By the end of the third day, the situation has reached a critical point. The number of dancers has grown to nearly 80, and new cases are being reported every few hours. The city's normal functions have ground to a halt, and panic is beginning to set in among the general population. Some families pack their belongings and flee the city entirely, convinced that staying any longer would put them at risk of being consumed by whatever supernatural force has taken hold of their neighbors. Others barricade themselves in their homes, afraid to venture onto the streets where they might catch sight of the dancers and become afflicted themselves. The dancing plague of 1518 has transformed from a medical curiosity into an existential threat to the survival of Strasbourg itself. Chapter 5. Desperate Measures. The fourth day brings with it a sense of desperation that hangs over Strasbourg like a thick fog. The city council, having exhausted conventional approaches to the crisis, finds itself considering increasingly radical solutions. The number of dancers has now swelled to over 100, and the original site can no longer contain them all. They've spread throughout the city center, their movements creating a bizarre spectacle that transforms familiar streets into something from a fever dream. The sound of their dancing has become omnipresent, a rhythmic heartbeat that pulses through every neighborhood and echoes off every building. "We must try something different," declares Mayor Johann von Zimmern, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Clearly, neither medical intervention nor religious ceremony has had any effect. Perhaps we need to approach this from an entirely new direction. It's at this point that one of the city's musicians, a man named Johann Böhm, who has spent his life playing at weddings and festivals, approaches the council with an unusual proposal. "Your Honors," he says, removing his cap and speaking with the careful deference required when addressing city officials. "I've been watching these poor souls for days now, and I believe I understand something that others have missed. They're not dancing randomly or chaotically. There's a pattern to their movements, a rhythm that they're all following. It's as if they're hearing music that the rest of us cannot perceive." The council members exchange skeptical glances. "What are you suggesting, Master Böhm?" asks the mayor. "I propose that we provide them with actual music," Böhm explains. "If they're already compelled to dance, perhaps we can help them dance themselves to exhaustion and recovery by providing proper musical accompaniment. I've seen this work in smaller cases of dancing mania before. Sometimes the afflicted need to literally dance it out of their systems." The suggestion seems counterintuitive, almost insane. The idea of encouraging the dancers rather than trying to stop them goes against every instinct. Yet given the complete failure of all other approaches, the council finds itself willing to consider even the most unconventional solutions. "How would this work?" asks Councilman Heinrich. "We gather the best musicians in the city," Böhm explains, warming to his theme. "We play lively, energetic music to help them dance with proper rhythm and technique. With actual musical accompaniment, they should be able to dance more efficiently, exhaust themselves more quickly, and eventually collapse into the kind of deep sleep that will break the spell." After much debate, the council decides to authorize Böhm's experiment. Within hours, musicians are recruited from across the city. Pipe players, drummers, lute players, and singers gather in the streets around the dancers, preparing to provide the musical accompaniment that Böhm believes will cure the affliction. The resulting spectacle is unlike anything Europe has ever seen. More than 100 people dance frantically in the streets, while dozens of musicians play wild, energetic tunes designed to help them exhaust themselves. The sound fills the entire city center, a chaotic symphony of human movement and musical rhythm that can be heard for miles around. At first, the plan seems to work. The dancers' movements become more coordinated and seemingly more purposeful. They appear to respond to the external music, incorporating its rhythms into their own internal compulsions. Some observers report that the afflicted seem happier, more animated, as if they're finally able to dance properly rather than struggling against some invisible musical force. But as the hours pass, it becomes clear that the musical intervention is not having the desired effect. Rather than exhausting themselves and collapsing into healing sleep, the dancers seem to be energized by the music. Their movements become more intense, more frantic. And most disturbing of all, the sound of the music begins to attract even more people to the dancing. By evening, the number of dancers has grown to nearly 150. The musical cure has backfired spectacularly, accelerating the spread of the affliction rather than containing it. "Stop the music!" shouts Mayor von Zimmern, his voice barely audible above the cacophony. Everyone stopped playing immediately. The musicians cease their performance, but the dancers continue their relentless movement, now apparently energized by the musical stimulation they've received. The silence that follows feels almost more disturbing than the previous chaos, broken only by the slapping of feet against stone and the labored breathing of the afflicted. As night falls, a sense of complete desperation settles over the city leadership. They've tried medicine, religion, and music, all without success. If anything, their interventions seem to have made the situation worse. It's at this point that a new voice enters the discussion, that of the local astrologers and scholars who have been quietly studying the phenomenon from their academic perspective. Master Wilhelm, the city's most respected astronomer and natural philosopher, requests an audience with the council. "Honored Mayor and Councilmen," he begins, "I believe we've been approaching this crisis from the wrong direction entirely. We've been trying to treat the symptoms rather than understanding the cause. If we can determine what force is compelling these people to dance, we might be able to devise a more effective intervention." "And what do you propose?" asks the mayor, willing to listen to any suggestion at this point. "I propose that we study the dancers more systematically," Wilhelm explains. "We need to understand who is being affected and why. Are there patterns based on age, gender, social class, or geographic location? Are there environmental factors we haven't considered? Is there something specific about this time and place that has made this outbreak possible?" The council authorizes Wilhelm's investigation, and over the following days, he and his assistants begin to compile detailed records of every aspect of the dancing plague. They interview family members of the afflicted, map the locations where new cases first appear, and document every detail of the dancers' behavior and physical condition. What they discover is both fascinating and disturbing. The dancers do indeed seem to be responding to some kind of internal rhythm or music, but it's not random or chaotic. There are patterns to their movements that suggest a kind of collective choreography, as if they're all participating in the same vast, invisible performance. More troubling still, Wilhelm's investigation reveals that the dancing plague is not entirely without precedent. Historical records show similar outbreaks in other European cities over the past century, though none as large or persistent as what Strasbourg is experiencing. This suggests, Wilhelm reports to the council, that we're dealing with a recurring phenomenon, something that appears periodically under specific conditions. If we can understand what triggers these outbreaks, we might be able to predict and prevent future occurrences. But understanding the historical context doesn't help with the immediate crisis. The dancers continue their relentless movement. Their numbers continue to grow, and the city remains paralyzed by the inexplicable spectacle unfolding in its streets. As the first week of the dancing plague draws to a close, Strasbourg finds itself facing a crisis unlike anything in its history. The normal rhythms of urban life have been completely disrupted. The economy is suffering severe damage, and there seems to be no end in sight to the supernatural force that has taken hold of more than a tenth of the city's population. The dancing plague of 1518 has become more than a medical mystery or a religious crisis. It has become an existential challenge to everything the people of Strasbourg thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. Chapter 6. The Peak of Madness. The second week of the dancing plague brings with it a level of chaos that pushes Strasbourg to the very brink of societal collapse. What began as one woman's inexplicable behavior has grown into a phenomenon that now affects more than 200 citizens, transforming the city into something that resembles a vision from the apocalypse more than a functioning medieval community. The dancers have spread throughout the entire city center. They fill the main squares, crowd the narrow side streets, and even spill into the courtyards of private homes and public buildings. Their movements have worn smooth patches into the cobblestones, creating a visible record of their relentless activity etched into the very stones of the city. The physical toll on the afflicted has become horrifying to witness. Many of the original dancers, including Frau Trophea herself, show signs of severe exhaustion and physical damage. Their feet are raw and bleeding, their clothing torn and soiled. Some have lost dangerous amounts of weight from their inability to eat or rest. Yet still they dance, as if controlled by a force more powerful than their own physical limitations. Several dancers have collapsed from sheer exhaustion, but even in their collapsed state, they continue to move their limbs in the familiar rhythmic patterns. Family members who try to carry them home find that the afflicted become violent and desperate when removed from the dancing grounds, fighting with a strength that seems impossible given their weakened condition. The city's medical establishment has completely given up on finding a cure. Dr. Paracelsus, the renowned physician who had arrived with such confidence, has quietly departed Strasbourg, admitting privately that he has encountered nothing in all his studies that prepares him to deal with such a phenomenon. This goes beyond the realm of natural philosophy, he tells a colleague before leaving. Whatever force is at work here operates according to principles that our current understanding cannot encompass. The economic devastation is now complete. Trade has ground to a halt, with merchant caravans refusing to enter a city that has become synonymous with supernatural horror. Local businesses have closed their doors, either because their proprietors have joined the dancers or because they're too terrified to venture onto the streets. The city's tax revenues have disappeared, leaving the government unable to provide basic services or maintain public order. Food shortages are beginning to develop as farmers and merchants from the surrounding countryside refuse to bring their goods into the city. Those citizens who remain unaffected find themselves struggling to obtain basic necessities. And there are reports of looting and violence as normal social constraints break down. The religious authorities have declared the dancing plague to be a clear sign of divine judgment upon Strasbourg for its sins. Special prayer services are held daily, calling upon God to forgive the city and lift the supernatural curse that has befallen it. But the dancers show no response to religious intervention, continuing their movements with the same mechanical persistence, regardless of prayers, holy water, or sacred relics. Some of the more radical religious figures begin to preach that the end times are approaching, that the dancing plague is one of the signs and wonders predicted in the book of Revelation. These apocalyptic sermons attract large crowds of terrified citizens seeking some kind of explanation for the inexplicable events they're witnessing. "Repent!" cries Brother Marcus, a wandering monk who has arrived to witness the plague for himself. The day of judgment approaches, and these poor souls dance at the command of demons sent to herald the final destruction of this sinful world. His words find eager listeners among a population desperate for any explanation that makes sense of their transformed reality. Some citizens begin to engage in extreme acts of penance. flagellating themselves publicly or giving away all their possessions to the church in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. But even as religious fervor grips part of the population, others begin to respond with increasing skepticism toward all authority figures. If the physicians cannot heal the dancers, if the priests cannot exorcise whatever possesses them, if the city council cannot restore order, then what good are these traditional sources of guidance and protection? Small groups of citizens begin to organize their own responses to the crisis. Some form vigilante patrols to maintain basic security in neighborhoods where normal law enforcement has broken down. Others create informal networks to share food and resources among families whose breadwinners have joined the dancers. A few of the more intellectually inclined citizens begin to develop their own theories about the plague's origins and nature. Master Wilhelm's systematic investigation has inspired others to observe and record the phenomenon with scientific detachment, even as the world around them seems to be dissolving into chaos. Notice how the dancing intensifies during certain hours of the day, observes Johann Kepler, a young scholar who has been documenting the plague's progression. There seems to be a relationship between the movements and the position of the sun, or perhaps the time that has elapsed since the plague began. These amateur investigators begin to notice other patterns as well. The afflicted seem to move in waves or cycles, with periods of intense activity followed by brief lulls. New dancers tend to join the group at specific times and in specific locations, suggesting that the contagion follows rules that might eventually be understood and predicted. But even as these efforts at rational analysis continue, the overall situation continues to deteriorate. By the middle of the second week, the number of dancers has reached nearly 300, and reports are coming in of similar outbreaks beginning in nearby villages and towns. The plague appears to be spreading beyond Strasbourg itself, carried by travelers and merchants who witnessed the dancing before fleeing the city. A small outbreak is reported in the village of Célestat, some 20 miles to the south. Another begins in Haguenau to the north. The regional authorities are beginning to consider quarantining the entire area to prevent further spread. It's at this point that the most disturbing development yet occurs. Among the newest dancers are several children, some as young as 10 or 12 years old. The sight of these young ones caught in the same relentless compulsion as the adults sends shockwaves through the remaining unaffected population. How can God permit innocent children to suffer such torment? Cries Maria Zimmermann, whose own daughter has joined the dancers despite all efforts to keep her away from the affected areas. What sin could a child have committed to deserve such punishment? The presence of children among the dancers forces the community to confront the full horror of their situation. These are not adults who might be held responsible for their own spiritual failings or moral corruption. These are innocents whose affliction cannot be explained by conventional notions of divine judgment or demonic temptation. The city's remaining clergy struggle to address this theological crisis. How can a just and merciful God permit such suffering among the innocent? What kind of divine plan could include the torment of children? The traditional explanations that have sustained medieval Christianity begin to seem inadequate in the face of such inexplicable horror. Some priests begin to question whether the dancing plague might be natural rather than supernatural in origin. Perhaps it's a disease of the mind rather than a spiritual affliction. Perhaps it can be understood through human reason rather than divine revelation. But such thoughts are dangerous in an age when questioning religious authority can lead to accusations of heresy. The priests who entertain these doubts do so quietly, in private conversations with trusted colleagues rather than in public sermons. Meanwhile, the practical challenges of maintaining a functioning city continue to mount, with hundreds of citizens unable to work or care for themselves. The burden of providing food, shelter, and basic care falls on the shrinking number of unaffected residents. Families find themselves caring not only for their own afflicted relatives, but also for neighbors and strangers whose own families have been overwhelmed by the crisis. The city's infrastructure begins to break down. Streets go unswept, filled with the debris and waste left by the constant crowds of dancers and observers. Water systems require maintenance that no one has time to provide. Public buildings stand empty and unguarded, their normal functions suspended indefinitely. Yet, even in the midst of this chaos, acts of extraordinary compassion and courage continue to occur. Unaffected citizens risk their own safety to bring food and water to exhausted dancers. Mothers and fathers maintain vigils over their afflicted children, protecting them from harm even though they cannot cure their condition. These acts of human kindness and solidarity provide small beacons of hope in an otherwise dark situation. They remind the community that even in the face of inexplicable horror, people can choose to respond with love and compassion rather than fear and abandonment. As the second week draws to a close, the dancing plague of 1518 reaches what will later be recognized as its peak intensity. Nearly 400 people are now affected, representing more than 1% of Strasbourg's entire population. The city has been transformed into something unrecognizable, a place where the normal rules of human behavior no longer seem to apply. The sound of the dancing has become a constant presence, audible day and night throughout the city center. It creates a rhythmic backdrop against which all other activities must be conducted. A reminder that the familiar world of medieval Strasbourg has been replaced by something far stranger and more threatening. Yet, even at this moment of maximum chaos, there are signs that the plague may have reached its limits. The rate of new cases has begun to slow slightly, and some observers believe they can detect subtle changes in the behavior of the earliest dancers. Perhaps the force that has gripped the city for nearly 2 weeks is finally beginning to weaken. But such hope remains tentative and fragile. Too much has happened. Too many assumptions about the nature of reality have been shattered for anyone to feel confident about predicting what might happen next. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. The third week of the dancing plague brings with it the first signs that the inexplicable force gripping Strasbourg may finally be beginning to weaken. The change is subtle at first, so slight that only the most careful observers notice it. But it represents the first ray of hope in what has seemed like an endless nightmare. Master Wilhelm, who has been documenting the plague with scientific precision, is among the first to notice the shift. The movements are becoming less synchronized, he reports to the city council. In the early days, all the dancers seemed to be following the same invisible rhythm. Now there are small variations, slight differences in timing and pattern that suggest the collective compulsion may be fragmenting. The council members, exhausted by weeks of crisis management and desperate for any sign of improvement, seize upon Wilhelm's observations with eager hope. Could it be that the plague is finally running its course? Might the city soon return to some semblance of normalcy? But even as these tentative signs of improvement appear, the situation remains desperately precarious. The dancers who have been afflicted longest show severe signs of physical deterioration. Several have collapsed completely, their bodies unable to sustain the relentless movement any longer. Yet even in their collapsed state, many continue to twitch and spasm, as if the compulsion to dance persists even when their bodies can no longer obey. Frau Trophea, the woman who began it all nearly 3 weeks ago, has become a figure of tragic fascination. Her once sturdy frame has been reduced to skin and bones, her clothing hangs in tatters, and her feet are so damaged that she leaves bloody footprints wherever she moves. Yet still she dances, her movements now mechanical and ghost-like, as if she has become more spirit than flesh. The sight of her condition forces the community to confront a disturbing possibility. What if the dancing plague doesn't simply end? What if those who have been afflicted longest are so damaged by their experience that they can never fully recover? The prospect of hundreds of permanently damaged citizens presents a challenge that could cripple Strasbourg for generations to come. It's during this period of uncertainty that a new figure arrives in the city, bringing with him ideas that will ultimately prove crucial to ending the crisis. Brother Augustine is a Benedictine monk from a monastery in the Vosges Mountains, a man known throughout the region for his learning and his compassionate approach to caring for the mentally afflicted. Unlike the previous religious figures who have attempted to address the plague through exorcism and condemnation, Brother Augustine approaches the situation with both spiritual insight and practical wisdom. He spends several days simply observing the dancers, studying their movements and behavior with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for sacred texts. I have seen similar afflictions in my work with the disturbed and the melancholic, he tells the city council. While the scale of this outbreak is unprecedented, the underlying nature of the condition may be more familiar than we have realized. These people are not possessed by demons, nor are they suffering from a physical disease in the conventional sense. They are trapped in a kind of collective madness, a shared delusion that has taken on a life of its own. Brother Augustine's explanation offers a framework for understanding the plague that is both more hopeful and more practical than the supernatural theories that have dominated previous discussions. If the dancing is indeed a form of madness rather than demonic possession, then it might be possible to treat it using methods developed for caring for the mentally afflicted. "What do you propose?" asks Mayor von Zimmern, his voice heavy with exhaustion, but touched with new hope. "We must break the collective nature of the delusion," Brother Augustine explains. "As long as the dancers can see and hear each other, they reinforce each other's compulsions. We need to separate them, to remove them from the environment that sustains their shared madness." The monk's proposal is radical. Rather than trying to treat the dancers where they are, he suggests moving them to a place where they cannot influence each other's behavior. He recommends the shrine of St. Vitus in the nearby village of Hohenstein, a site known for its healing properties and its peaceful, isolated setting. St. Vitus is the patron saint of dancers and those afflicted with involuntary movement, Brother Augustine explains. If anywhere can provide healing for these poor souls, it would be at his shrine. Moreover, the journey itself, the change of environment, may help to break the psychological bonds that hold them in their current state. The proposal faces significant opposition from both religious and secular authorities. Moving hundreds of afflicted people over mountainous terrain seems dangerous and potentially impossible. Many of the dancers are too weak to travel, and there's no guarantee that removing them from Strasbourg will actually improve their condition. But with all other options exhausted, the city council eventually agrees to attempt Brother Augustine's plan. The logistics are daunting. They need to organize transportation for nearly 400 people, many of whom are in poor physical condition and all of whom are unable to cooperate normally with travel arrangements. The evacuation begins on a gray morning in early August. Nearly a month after Frau Trophea first began to dance. Carts and wagons are assembled from throughout the region, and volunteers are recruited to help with the massive undertaking. The dancers are loaded onto the vehicles with great difficulty, as many resist being moved and continue their rhythmic movements even while lying down. The procession that winds its way out of Strasbourg is unlike anything the region has ever seen. Hundreds of people in various states of physical distress, all moving with the same persistent rhythm, accompanied by equally large numbers of family members, medical attendants, and religious personnel. The entire convoy stretches for nearly a mile along the mountain roads, creating a spectacle that draws observers from villages and towns throughout the area. The journey to Hohenstein takes 2 days, during which several of the weakest dancers die from the combination of exhaustion and the stress of travel. Their deaths cast a shadow over the entire expedition, raising questions about whether the attempt to move the afflicted has been a terrible mistake. But as the convoy climbs higher into the mountains, away from the urban environment of Strasbourg and into the quiet forests and meadows of the Vosges, some observers begin to notice subtle changes in the dancers' behavior. Their movements seem less frantic, less synchronized. A few even appear to fall into natural sleep for brief periods, something that hasn't happened since the plague began. The shrine of St. Vitus sits in a small valley surrounded by pine forests, a place of remarkable peace and natural beauty. The church itself is modest but ancient, built of local stone and surrounded by gardens tended by the small community of monks who maintain the holy site. As the dancers are unloaded from their transport vehicles and arranged in the open areas around the shrine, something extraordinary begins to happen. One by one, in small groups and then in larger numbers, they begin to stop dancing. The cessation doesn't happen all at once or in any dramatic fashion. Instead, individual dancers simply slow their movements, then pause, then sink to the ground in exhaustion. It's as if the change of environment has broken whatever invisible bonds held them in their compulsive state. Frau Trophea is among the last to stop, her movements gradually slowing over the course of several hours until she finally collapses into what appears to be natural sleep. The sight of her still, peaceful form after weeks of relentless motion brings tears to the eyes of many who have witnessed her ordeal. By the evening of the second day at Hohenstein, fewer than 50 dancers remain active, and their movements are noticeably less intense than before. The collective compulsion that has gripped Strasbourg for nearly a month appears to be finally releasing its hold on the afflicted population. The transformation is remarkable, not just for its scope, but for its apparent naturalness. There are no dramatic exorcisms, no miraculous interventions, no sudden divine revelations. The dancers simply stop, as if the force that had compelled them for so long has finally exhausted itself or found its natural conclusion. Brother Augustin moves among the recovering dancers, offering prayers and comfort, but also careful observation. The mind is a fragile thing, he tells the assembled physicians and clergy. When it becomes trapped in patterns of madness, sometimes the gentlest intervention is also the most effective. Simply removing these people from the environment that sustained their delusion has been enough to allow their natural healing processes to begin. The dancing plague of 1518 is finally coming to an end. Chapter 8. Recovery and Reflection. The weeks following the journey to Hohenstein marked the beginning of a slow and complex recovery process, not just for the individual dancers, but for the entire community of Strasbourg. The city that had been transformed into a scene from a medieval nightmare must now find its way back to something resembling normal life. The physical recovery of the dancers varies tremendously from person to person. Some of the most recent additions to their number, those who had been dancing for only a few days, recover quickly once their compulsive movements cease. Within a week of arriving at the shrine, they are able to eat normal meals, engage in conversation, and begin the journey back to their ordinary lives. But for others, particularly those who had been dancing since the earliest days of the plague, the recovery process is much more difficult. Weeks of relentless movement have taken a severe toll on their bodies. Many suffer from malnutrition, dehydration, and injuries to their feet and legs. Some show signs of what we might now recognize as traumatic stress, exhibiting confusion, memory loss, and difficulty readjusting to normal patterns of sleep and wakefulness. Frau Trophea herself represents the most challenging case. The woman who began the entire phenomenon remains in a state of semi-consciousness for several days after her dancing finally stops. When she does begin to speak again, she claims to have no memory of the events of the previous month. To her, it seems as if she went to sleep in her own bed in Strasbourg and awakened in a monastery surrounded by strangers. I remember going about my daily tasks, she tells Brother Augustine, her voice weak but lucid. I was preparing the evening meal, I think, and then nothing. How did I come to be here? Why do my feet hurt so terribly? Why is everyone looking at me as if I've done something remarkable? The amnesia that afflicts many of the recovered dancers becomes a source of both relief and frustration for their families and the broader community. On one hand, it spares them the psychological trauma of remembering their weeks of uncontrolled behavior. On the other hand, it means that they cannot provide any insight into what the experience was like from the inside, what might have caused it, or how similar outbreaks might be prevented in the future. The medical community struggles to understand what they have witnessed. Dr. Paracelsus, who had left Strasbourg in defeat, returns to study the recovery process and interview the formerly afflicted. His findings are both fascinating and troubling. The dancers show no signs of the physical ailments that typically accompany prolonged exertion, he reports. Their muscles are not damaged in the way we would expect from weeks of continuous movement. Their hearts show no signs of strain. It's as if their bodies were somehow protected from the normal consequences of their actions while they were in the grip of the dancing compulsion. This observation adds another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable phenomenon. If the dancing plague was not a conventional illness, and if it did not even cause the physical damage that should have resulted from such extreme behavior, then what exactly was it? Brother Augustine offers what becomes the most widely accepted explanation, at least among religious authorities. I believe we witnessed a collective affliction of the soul rather than the body, he writes in his detailed account of the events. The dancers were trapped in a kind of spiritual prison, cut off from their normal connection to divine grace. Only by removing them from the environment that sustained this spiritual darkness could their souls find their way back to the light. His explanation satisfies many, but it also raises troubling questions about the nature of divine justice and protection. If God permits such afflictions to occur, what does that say about the security of faith itself? If entire communities can be swept up in collective madness, what prevents it from happening again? The economic recovery of Strasbourg proves to be more straightforward than the spiritual and psychological healing. Trade gradually resumes as word spreads that the dancing plague has ended. Merchants who had avoided the city begin to return, and the markets slowly fill with goods and customers once again. but the city's reputation has been permanently altered. Strasbourg is now known throughout Europe as the place where hundreds of people dance themselves nearly to death for no apparent reason. The story spreads along trade routes and through scholarly networks, becoming a cautionary tale about the fragility of human reason and social order. Some cities implement new regulations designed to prevent similar outbreaks. Public dancing is restricted or banned entirely in several German towns. Religious authorities issue warnings about the dangers of collective enthusiasm and the need for careful supervision of popular gatherings. The scholarly community begins to develop new theories about mass hysteria and collective behavior. The dancing plague of 1518 becomes one of the first well-documented cases of what will eventually be understood as psychogenic illness, a condition where psychological factors manifest as physical symptoms that can spread through populations under certain conditions. Master Wilhelm, whose careful documentation of the plague has provided invaluable historical records, continues his research into similar phenomena. He discovers accounts of dancing manias dating back centuries, though none as large or well-documented as what Strasbourg experienced. There appears to be something in human nature that makes us susceptible to these collective delusions under certain conditions, he writes. Perhaps it is related to the same impulses that drive people to gather in crowds, to participate in festivals and religious ceremonies, to lose themselves in shared experiences that transcend individual consciousness. His observations prove remarkably prescient, anticipating by centuries the development of crowd psychology and the scientific study of mass behavior phenomena. The individual stories of recovery are as varied as the people who experience them. Some of the former dancers return to their previous lives with little apparent change, resuming their work and family relationships as if the dancing plague had been nothing more than a strange dream. Others find that the experience has fundamentally altered their perspective on life, leading them to make significant changes in their priorities and behaviors. Several of the recovered dancers join religious communities, interpreting their experience as a divine calling to dedicate their lives to spiritual pursuits. Others become advocates for the poor and afflicted, using their own experience of helplessness to develop compassion for others who suffer from conditions beyond their control. A few never fully recover their previous mental stability. They remain prone to episodes of confusion and disorientation, as if the dancing plague has left them permanently changed in ways that their families and communities struggle to understand and accommodate. The families of those who died during the plague face the additional challenge of grieving for loved ones, whose deaths seem both tragic and meaningless. How do you mourn someone who died not from disease or accident or violence, but from an inexplicable compulsion to dance? How do you find meaning in such a senseless loss? Brother Augustine works extensively with these grieving families, helping them to find ways to understand their losses within the framework of Christian faith. God's ways are mysterious, he tells them, but his love for us is constant. Those who died in the plague were not abandoned by divine mercy. They were called home in a manner that we cannot fully understand, but must learn to accept. His words provide comfort to some, but others struggle with lasting bitterness about the apparently random nature of who was afflicted and who was spared, who recovered and who did not survive. As autumn arrives in Strasbourg, the city has largely returned to its normal rhythms. Markets bustle with activity. Churches hold their regular services. Children play in the streets where the dancers once moved in endless circles. The physical evidence of the plague has been swept away. The worn patches in the cobblestones repaired, the makeshift shelters and medical stations dismantled. But the memory of those extraordinary weeks remains vivid in the minds of everyone who witnessed them. The dancing plague of 1518 has become part of Strasbourg's identity, a shared experience that binds the community together, even as it raises questions that may never be fully answered. Epilogue. The mystery endures. As we reach the end of our long journey through the streets of 16th century Strasbourg, it's worth reflecting on what the dancing plague of 1518 tells us about the mysterious nature of human behavior and the limits of human understanding. The story we've explored tonight has been passed down through 5 centuries, analyzed by historians, psychologists, and medical researchers. Yet it remains as puzzling today as it was to the people who lived through it. In our modern age of scientific advancement and technological sophistication, we are no closer to a definitive explanation for what happened in those summer weeks of 1518 than were the physicians and scholars who witnessed it firsthand. Some contemporary researchers have proposed that the dancing plague was caused by ergot poisoning, a condition that can result from eating rye contaminated with a particular fungus. Ergot poisoning can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and other neurological symptoms that might explain the compulsive dancing. But this theory fails to account for the selective nature of the affliction, the fact that it spread from person to person through observation rather than through shared food sources, and the specific choreographic patterns that the dancers seem to follow. Others have suggested that the plague was an early example of mass psychogenic illness, a condition where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms that can spread through populations under certain social and cultural conditions. This explanation has more support from the historical evidence, particularly the fact that the dancing stopped when the afflicted were removed from the urban environment where the phenomenon had begun. But even the mass hysteria theory leaves many questions unanswered. What specific stresses or conditions in 1518 Strasbourg created the perfect environment for such an outbreak? Why did it take the particular form of dancing rather than some other compulsive behavior? And why has nothing quite like it ever been documented again, despite the fact that human communities have faced similar stresses and challenges throughout history? Perhaps the most honest answer is that the dancing plague of 1518 represents one of those rare moments when human behavior transcends our ability to categorize and explain it. In a world where we like to believe that everything can be understood through scientific analysis and rational thought, the story of Frau Trophäa and her fellow dancers reminds us that mystery still exists, that there are aspects of human experience that remain beyond our comprehension. The people of Strasbourg eventually moved on from their extraordinary experience, but they never forgot it. The story was passed down through generations, becoming part of the city's folklore and identity. Children grew up hearing about the summer when their grandparents' generation danced in the streets, and they carried that story forward to their own children and grandchildren. In many ways, the dancing plague became a metaphor for the unpredictable nature of life itself. Just as the residents of Strasbourg had no warning that their ordinary world was about to be turned upside down by an inexplicable phenomenon, so too do we all live with the knowledge that our own carefully ordered lives could be disrupted at any moment by forces beyond our control or understanding. But the story also speaks to the resilience of human communities and the power of compassion to help us through even the most bewildering crises. Throughout the weeks of the plague, people continued to care for each other, to seek solutions, to maintain hope, even in the face of the impossible. Brother Augustine's gentle wisdom ultimately proved more effective than all the learned theories of the physicians and theologians, reminding us that sometimes the simplest acts of human kindness can accomplish what the most sophisticated interventions cannot. The dancing plague of 1518 has inspired countless works of art, literature, and music over the centuries. Painters have tried to capture the visual spectacle of hundreds of people dancing in medieval streets. Writers have used it as a metaphor for social contagion and collective madness. Musicians have attempted to imagine what kind of rhythm might have compelled such relentless movement. Each artistic interpretation adds another layer to our understanding of the phenomenon, even as it remains ultimately unexplainable. Perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps some human experiences are meant to remain mysterious, to remind us that for all our scientific progress and technological achievement, we still live in a world full of wonder and inexplicable beauty. As you drift off to sleep tonight, dear listeners, you might find yourself thinking about the rhythm of your own days, the patterns that guide your movements through the world. You might wonder what invisible forces shape your behavior, what collective currents influence your thoughts and actions in ways you don't fully recognize. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that we are all more connected to each other than we sometimes realize, that individual consciousness exists within larger patterns of human experience that we only dimly understand. It suggests that beneath the surface of our ordinary lives, currents of meaning and mystery continue to flow, occasionally breaking through into our awareness in ways that transform everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our world. And so we leave the dancers of Strasbourg to their eternal rest, their story preserved in the historical record as a testament to the enduring mystery of human nature. Their extraordinary experience continues to echo through the centuries, a reminder that in any age, in any place, the impossible might suddenly become real, and the familiar world might transform into something wonderful and terrible, and utterly beyond our understanding. The cobblestones of Strasbourg have long since been repaved, the medieval buildings replaced by modern structures, the rhythms of 16th century life replaced by the different but equally complex patterns of our contemporary world. But somewhere in the collective memory of humanity, the dancers continue their eternal movement, following a rhythm that only they could hear, participating in a mystery that will never be fully solved. Sleep well, dear listeners, and may your dreams be filled with wonder at the beautiful, inexplicable mystery of human existence. And if you should happen to hear distant music in your sleep, music that seems to call to something deep within your soul, remember the story of Strasbourg and choose your steps carefully.